where you have created a level and you have built it with these primitives. This process is typically called white boxing or gray boxing. This is just a way to block in a level and to test gameplay. Now in this case, what we want to do is we want to begin overriding the assets with actual assets. So in this case, what I want you to do is I want you to import a Unity package. To do this, we're going to go ahead and go to Assets and right-click on that folder, and we're going to say Import Package, Custom Package. Go ahead and navigate to the Unity Fundamentals M3_begin package, and then open that file. This is going to decompress the package, and it's going to include all of the assets that we'll need for this particular module. When it comes up, it's going to show you the assets that are going to be brought in. In this case, you'll notice that the animations folder and the animations that include in there are giving us this warning, and it's saying these files already exist. Do you want to overwrite them? In our case, I'm going to say no. So I'm just going to turn off that animations folder, and it's going to deselect everything there. The next thing that we have is the meshes folder, and it's telling me the same thing. This folder already exists. Do you want me to overwrite it? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say yes. It can import all of these assets in as needed. Now this is where you can get the dwarf rig and the animations included, and so you don't have to worry about importing those from another file or anything like that. So this is everything that we need. Let me go ahead and actually import the animations as well, just so that way you have them in your project too. So I'm going to import them, and we'll give this just a few moments to import all of those assets. Now that those files have imported, you can see that we have a few more folders and we have several assets that we can begin to play with. So looking at this, what we want to do is we want to replace our floor, and I'm going to do that using a terrain. So now that these assets have been added into the scene, let's go ahead and replace our floor with an asset called a terrain. To create a terrain, we'll simply go up to Game Object, 3D Object, Terrain. You can also go to Create in the Hierarchy panel, 3D Object, Terrain. Doing this is going to create a terrain object, and if we hold down Alt and the left mouse button and orbit around, you can see that this terrain object is very large. In order for me to see things a little bit easier, I'm going to turn the lighting down just a little bit, or you can actually turn it off. This does make things just a little bit easier to look at. Now this terrain object is very, very large, and I'm going to go to the settings of the terrain object. Now if you don't see these settings, you'll need to make sure that the terrain object is selected in your hierarchy, and that should update in the inspector. To reduce the size of our terrain, let's go to Settings, and then at the very bottom of the terrain, we're going to go to the terrain width and length. In our case, let's knock this down to 20. Actually, let's do 25 by 25. This makes it a lot more manageable. And we also want to set the terrain height. Right now, this is set to 600. Let's go ahead and set it to something like 10. Now, anytime that we create a terrain, it is actually being driven by a height map. Let's make sure that our height map resolution is set to 513, and we need to make sure that we leave it as that default value. Typically, with texture resolutions, you would see 512, but with a terrain, you need to add 1 to that. So in our case, if we set our height map resolution to 1024, it would actually be 1025. Now the detail resolution, we're going to leave at 1024, and we're going to do detail resolution per pixel set to 8. The default values are pretty good and will give us a result that we need. Now in this, we also have the ability to paint our own height map, or we could import our height map. In this case, let's talk about painting first, and then we'll import one that I've already created. Going up to the top, back to our terrain object, let's click on the Raise Terrain tool. This will allow you to choose the shape of your brush, and then you can adjust the settings of that brush. In this case, we have our brush size set. Let's go ahead and bring it up to 100 for now. And then we have our opacity. This is basically the overall strength that the terrain will begin to rise whenever we paint on it. To begin painting your terrain, all you need to do is left-click and hold on the terrain. Using a value of 10 allows that to rise slowly. I typically like to do it this way instead of getting right to it very quickly. So we'll just go around the outside edge and we'll create some mountain type areas. To make this go a little bit faster, let's maybe set this to 20 and then start to raise that up. All you have to do is hold down the left mouse button and allow it to raise to the desired height. Now, whenever we create the terrain, we also have the ability to lower that terrain. To lower it, you'll hold down Shift and then left-click and hold. And you'll notice that that begins to make it flat. Now, lowering the terrain, it does have a base depth, and in this case, it's at 0. If you wanted to create hills and valleys, you would need to make sure that your terrain height is set high enough, and then you would basically paint up to get the overall height, and then paint down to get those valleys. This is always going to be your lowest point on your terrain. So in this case, I would like it to be fairly flat, except for around the edges. You can continue to paint around those edges and create a design that works best for you. Now, beyond this, we have the ability to paint to a specific height. So in our case, let's say that we have a height set, and we can type in a value here. We can say, let's do a height of 1. With that, if I were to left-click and hold and begin to paint up, you'll notice that it flattens off at a height of 1 meter, or one unit in Unity. I could go ahead and left-click and drag, and you can see that I could begin to create these little plateaus in our scene. Now, you can also choose a height based on your height map itself, and you can do that by holding down Shift and then left-clicking, and then once you release and you start to paint, you'll notice that the height is much different here. Notice how it's not exactly the same. Now, you also have the ability to flatten the entire object, and you can flatten the object to a specific height. So in this case, we're flattening it to 0.46581. If you want to flatten it down to 0, type in 0 and then hit flatten. This is a quick way to create a terrain that has hills and valleys in it. So if you set your height to 10 and then hit flatten, you'll notice that it's up here. And then now if we use the rise and lower tool, you can hold Shift and you can begin to create these areas. Now in our case, I'm not creating anything like this. So I'm going to go back to the flatten tool, set this to 0, and then hit flatten. Perfect. So now we have the flatten tool. Let's go to the smooth tool. The smooth tool will allow you to smooth out anything that you've painted so far. So I can come in and say smooth, and then flatten that out. And the longer you hold it, it will smooth it down and begin to lower it. Now in our case, the opacity is pretty small, and so we're not going to see much of a change. Let's bump that up and then really start to smooth this out. You'll see that it's averaging out the height of those points with the surrounding areas. This can take a long time to flatten out, so that's why the flatten brush is much better, or even the lower. So hold down Shift, that will allow it to lower. Now it's important to know that the settings of the brush will carry across all of the tools. So as you change one, it will change across. Let's go ahead and set this back to around 20. Now we have the paint texture. This will allow you to paint terrain textures on your mesh. Now we don't have any textures set up for this just yet, but we can talk about them in just a moment. We also have the ability to paint trees. where we can add trees to our list, and then we have the ability to paint details like rocks or grass. This is done in the exact same way by adding objects to a list and then choosing from that list and painting those in. We've already seen the general settings, and we'll leave those just as they are. It's important to know that this course is not going to give you a full view as to what you can do with terrains, but you can begin to experiment at this point. So now that we have played around with some of the tools, let's go ahead and import a height map that I've already created. To do this, we'll go to the Settings tools, and then we'll go down to Import Raw. By clicking on that, it's going to bring us to our file browser. And in this case, I'm going to browse to our reference files folder in our project files, and you'll see terrain.raw. Go ahead and open that, and it's going to bring up the import height map options. Let's go ahead and leave them as default, and we want to insert the values of the terrain size. In this case, we're going to do 25, 10, and 25. Go ahead and import that, and you'll see that we were given a very small map with these hills. And these are very small hills. These are not mountains. So this is important to understand too as well. Whenever you're creating a terrain, it's good to have a reference object like your character in place. So as you can see here, this is just a very small area that our player can play in. We're just creating a very small scene. So now that we have that in place, let's take some time to talk about how to paint our terrain.